In Surah 33, verse 21 of the Quran, Allah declares, "You have indeed in the Apostle of Allah a beautiful pattern of conduct for anyone whose hope is in Allah and the final day and who engages much in the praise of Allah." So Muhammad is a beautiful pattern of conduct for Muslims. I certainly hope that our Muslim friends don't take this verse too seriously, because early Muslim sources agree that Muhammad tried repeatedly to commit suicide. He tried to kill himself so many times that we could fairly call him the prophet of suicide, or the suicidal messenger. Sounds like the name of a punk band. Now, there are various reasons people decide to kill themselves. Some people have psychological problems that give them an urge to kill themselves. Others don't have any mental health issues, but so many bad things happen that they don't see any point in living. Still others have more nefarious reasons. My girlfriend left me, so I'll teach her a lesson and kill myself. With regard to Muhammad, the questions we need to ask are: 1. Why did Muhammad try repeatedly to kill himself? And 2. What do his suicide attempts tell us about his psychological state? Let's read some Muslim sources on Muhammad's ongoing battle with suicide. In the history of At-Tabari, we learn that Muhammad was suicidal before the first verses of the Quran were revealed to him. During one of his annual pagan religious retreats, a spirit appeared to him and said, "Muhammad, you are the messenger of God." Muhammad then ran home to his wife Khadijah and begged her to cover him. He was so terrified that he contemplated suicide. We read in At-Tabari, volume 6, page 68, "He, Muhammad, said, 'I had been thinking of hurling myself down from a mountain crag. But he appeared to me, as I was thinking about this, and said, Muhammad, I am Gabriel, and you are the messenger of God. Then he said, recite. I said, what shall I recite? He took me and pressed me 3 times tightly until I was nearly stifled and was utterly exhausted. Then he said, recite in the name of your Lord who created. And I recited it. Then I went to Khadijah and said, I have been in fear for my life." Notice that Muhammad was already suicidal when Gabriel started revealing the Quran to him. Gabriel had appeared to Muhammad, terrifying him and causing him to think about killing himself, and only then did Gabriel give him the opening verses of Surah 96. But Muhammad was also suicidal after Gabriel began revealing the Quran. According to Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, our earliest detailed biographical record on the life of Muhammad, page 106, Muhammad wanted to kill himself even after the revelations started, because he believed that he was possessed by an evil spirit. Muhammad was having a nightmare about a spirit physically attacking him and forcing him to recite verses of the Quran. When he finally agreed to recite the verses, the spirit that attacked him said, "Read in the name of thy Lord who created man of blood coagulated. Read, thy Lord is the most beneficent, who taught by the pen, taught that which they knew not unto men." Muhammad narrates, "So I read it, and he departed from me. And I awoke from my sleep, and it was as though these words were written on my heart. Now none of God's creatures was more hateful to me than an ecstatic poet or a man possessed. I could not even look at them. I thought, woe is me, poet or possessed. Never shall Quraysh, that's Muhammad's tribe, say this of me. I will go to the top of the mountain and throw myself down, that I may kill myself and gain rest. So I went forth to do so, and then, when I was midway on the mountain, I heard a voice from heaven saying, O Muhammad, thou art the apostle of God, and I am Gabriel." So Muhammad received the revelations, but after his encounter with Gabriel, he was convinced that he was possessed by an evil spirit. Since he didn't want his tribe to know that he was possessed, he decided to kill himself. But Gabriel stopped him. Gabriel had his work cut out for him, however, because Muhammad had a habit of trying to jump off a cliff whenever he was feeling bad. When Muhammad's wife Khadijah saw that her husband was suicidal, she and her cousin Waraka talked to him and convinced him that he wasn't possessed. He was a prophet of Allah. But Waraka soon died, and the revelations suddenly stopped. Guess who decided to kill himself? Let's find out in Sahih al-Bukhari, number 6982. But after a few days, Waraka died, and the divine revelation was also paused for a while, and the prophet became so sad, as we have heard, that he intended several times, we're talking about multiple occasions, to throw himself from the tops of high mountains, multiple mountains, and every time he went up to the top of a mountain in order to throw himself down, notice that he actually set out to kill himself numerous times, Jibreel, that's Gabriel, would appear before him and say, "O Muhammad, you are indeed Allah's messenger in truth," whereupon his heart would become quiet and he would calm down and would return home. So Gabriel had to regularly calm Muhammad down to keep him from plunging to his death. And whenever the period of the coming of the revelation used to become long, he would do as before, he'd head for a cliff. But when he used to reach the top of a mountain, Jibreel would appear before him and say to him what he had said before. Notice that this happened over and over again. Whenever Gabriel didn't show up with a new revelation, Muhammad would climb a mountain in order to kill himself. What can we learn about Muhammad from these passages? Well, when Gabriel spoke to him for the first time, he became suicidal out of fear. So when Muhammad was scared, he wanted to kill himself. After Gabriel roughed him up in his dream and he woke up with verses of the Quran in his head, Muhammad tried to jump off a cliff because he thought that he was demon-possessed, and he didn't want his tribe to make fun of him. So Muhammad would rather die than hear people calling him names. Later, when Muhammad was convinced that he was a prophet and Gabriel would ignore him for a while, Muhammad would again try to kill himself because he thought that Gabriel had rejected him. So Gabriel would have to show up and talk Muhammad away from the edge of the cliff. Muhammad, it seems, was a very needy man with a very fragile psyche. Not surprisingly, the revelations he received had to constantly remind him and his critics that he wasn't insane. Surah 7, verse 184 of the Quran. Do they not reflect? There is no madness in their companion, Muhammad. He is but a plain warner. Surah 23, verse 70. Or do they say he is possessed? Nay, he has brought them the truth, but most of them hate the truth. Surah 34, verse 46. Say, O Muhammad, I do admonish you on one point, that you stand up for Allah, in pairs or singly, and reflect within yourselves. Your companion, Muhammad, is not possessed. He is no less than a warner to you, in face of a terrible penalty. Surah 37, verses 35 to 36. For they, when they were told that there is no God except Allah, would puff themselves up with pride and say, What? Shall we give up our gods for the sake of a poet possessed? Nay, he has come with the truth, and he confirms the message of the apostles before him. Surah 52, verse 29. Therefore remind and preach, O Muhammad, by the grace of Allah, you are neither a soothsayer nor a madman. Surah 68, verse 2. You, O Muhammad, are not, by the grace of your Lord, a madman. Surah 81, verse 22. And, O people, your companion, Muhammad, is not a madman. Remember that these verses were delivered for recitation. Muslims had to recite these over and over. Muslims from the time of Muhammad right down to right now recite verses insisting that Muhammad was perfectly sane. Apparently, Muhammad never realized that the more you tell people you're not crazy and the more you demand that they say you're not crazy, the crazier you sound. Because normal people don't need to go around saying, I'm not crazy, I'm not crazy, I'm not crazy. Normal people don't need to tell people, I want you all to memorize and recite these verses saying that I'm not crazy. So, sorry Muslims, but your prophet sounds really, really crazy. Islam is a religion that flows out of the insecurities and emotional problems of a 7th century, mentally unstable, suicidal caravan trader. Think about the true role of Islam for Muhammad. Muhammad couldn't bear the thought of people making fun of him. Surprise, surprise, in Islam, the penalty for making fun of Muhammad was death. Even today, drawing a cartoon of Muhammad might get you killed. Muhammad was terrified of rejection. He would rather die than be rejected by his tribe. He would rather die than be ignored by Gabriel. Lo and behold, his tribe was eventually forced, with 10,000 swords at their throats, to accept him as a prophet. Leaving Islam, was a death penalty. You couldn't reject Muhammad if you wanted to. And Muhammad became, in Islam, the most important human being in all of history, someone Gabriel could never ignore. Today, more than 1 billion Muslims spend a shocking portion of their lives showering Muhammad with praises and blessings. 14 centuries after his death, his followers are still giving him the affirmation and attention he craved, not realizing that the point of the religion was to keep him from killing himself. The sad irony is that the religion that was meant to preserve Muhammad's life eventually got him killed. If you'd like to know how Muhammad died, click on this video. Spoiler alert, he was poisoned by a Jewish woman whose family had been slaughtered by Muslims. The worst part is that millions of people have been killed in the name of a religion whose purpose was to protect the life of a single man. And people are being killed every day, all because Muhammad needed to feel important. This is one of the many reasons Muhammad is the last person I would ever call a beautiful pattern of conduct. Muhammad's first impression of his revelations was that they were demonic in origin. Muhammad's first impression of his revelations was that they were demonic. So you've heard that Muhammad received revelations through the angel Gabriel. That was a later Muslim position. Muhammad eventually came to believe that. But when he first started receiving revelations, he did not have a very good opinion of them. And let me go ahead and read the passage. This is from Ibn Ishaq's Surat Rasulullah. This describes the night that Muhammad began receiving revelations. When it was the night on which God honored him with his mission and showed mercy on his servants thereby, Gabriel brought him the command of God. He came to me, said the apostle of God, while I was asleep, with a coverlet of brocade whereupon was some writing, and said, "Read." I said, "What shall I read?" He pressed me with it so tightly that I thought it was death. Then he let me go and said, "Read." I said, "What shall I read?" He pressed me with it again so that I thought it was death. Then he let me go and said, "Read." I said, "What shall I read?" He pressed me with it the third time so that I thought it was death and said, "Read." I said, "What then shall I read?" And this I said only to deliver myself from him, lest he should do the same to me again. He said, "Read in the name of thy Lord who created man of blood coagulated. Read, thy Lord is the most beneficent, who taught by the pen, taught that which he knew not unto men." So I read it, and he departed from me, and I woke from my sleep, and it was as though these words were written on my heart. So that's the first revelation that Muhammad received from what he would eventually regard as the angel Gabriel. But here's the important point. When Muhammad ran out of that cave, terrified, he didn't think that he had encountered the angel Gabriel. He believed that he was possessed. So anyway, the passage continues. Now, none of God's creatures was more hateful to me than an ecstatic poet or a man possessed. I could not even look at them. I thought, "Woe is me, poet or possessed. Never shall Quraysh say this of me." So Muhammad didn't want his tribe to realize that he was possessed. And so he came up with a plan, which is actually going to be our next point. But think about this. Sometimes, my friends, first impressions are the correct ones, right? And when Muhammad encountered whatever it was that he encountered, when it keeps pressing on him until he thinks it's death, he thinks it's something profoundly bad. He doesn't think, "Oh, I've encountered the Lord, I've encountered one of his angels." He doesn't think that. He thinks this is something very, very bad. And it's actually other people who convinced him, "No, it wasn't something demonic. That was an angel." It wasn't anyone who was there either, right? It's his wife Khadija,
bint Khuwaylid, yes,
and her cousin,
who didn't even know the content of the revelation that this so-called angel was eventually to bring to Muhammad. All he heard was Muhammad say, "This is what happened." And according to the tradition, Waraqah bin Nawfal says, that was her cousin, who supposedly was a Christian who studied the gospel, if what you tell him is the truth, then the same namus, meaning the same lawgiver that appeared to Moses has appeared to you, and you're a prophet to these people.
Yeah, so the ultimate
credibility of Islam doesn't go to Muhammad, it goes to Khadijah and her cousin, right?
Yes.
It goes to Khadijah and her cousin, because they're the ones who said, no, you've just met an angel. So it's important to realize this, where the real authority lies in Islam. But Muhammad's first impression, again, was that whatever he had encountered was demonic. It was other people who weren't there, who had no idea what he had experienced, who convinced him otherwise.
As a side note, real quick, the word for possession in Arabic, or madman in Arabic, is majnoon. Majnoon literally means possessed by a jinn possessed. And from a Christian perspective, jinns are nothing more than evil spirits or demons. So Muhammad actually is recorded in the Arabic as saying, I'm majnoon, jinn possessed.
Both Christianity and Islam teach that there are powerful dark forces at work all around us. If someone is clearly being influenced by these dark forces, how can we trust what he tells us about God? According to Muslim sources, when Muhammad received his first revelation in the cave on Mount Hira, he believed that he was possessed by a demon. And if you read what the Muslim sources say about how Muhammad received his revelations, you'll understand why he thought he was possessed. His encounters with Gabriel sound like something out of an exorcist film. Muhammad's face would turn red, his heart would race, the veins in his neck would swell up, his shoulders would tremble, he would come down with a fever, his lips would move rapidly, he would hear ringing or voices, he would sweat profusely, even in the cold. According to Muslim sources, once Muhammad became convinced that he was demon-possessed, he tried to commit suicide by hurling himself off a cliff. According to Muslim sources, Muhammad delivered revelations to his followers promoting polytheism, the infamous satanic verses. After a while, he came back and said that Satan had tricked him into delivering these verses. Apparently, Muhammad just couldn't tell the difference between inspiration from God and inspiration from the devil. According to Muslim sources, Muhammad was the victim of black magic that gave him delusional thoughts and false beliefs. This is crucial because the Quran tells us that magic is taught by demons. Since magic was successful over Muhammad, demons had power over Muhammad. I can't imagine someone less reliable on a spiritual level than the Prophet of Islam.
Muhammad tried repeatedly to kill himself. You Muslims out there who believe in Muhammad, you are believing in a man who tried repeatedly to commit suicide. According to the Muslim sources, he tried to commit suicide after receiving these revelations because he didn't want his tribe to be able to say that he was possessed by a jinn. And according to Sahih al-Bukhari, your most trusted, reliable source on the life of Muhammad, he tried again to kill himself later on when revelation stopped.
That's right.
So let me go ahead and read two passages, and then we'll continue moving. So I'll go ahead and finish the passage that I read in point number 10. He says, "Now none of God's creatures was more hateful to me than an ecstatic poet or a man possessed. I could not even look at them. I thought, woe is me, poet or possessed. Never shall Quraysh say this of me. I will go to the top of the mountain and throw myself down that I may kill myself and gain rest." He wanted rest from whatever this was that was tormenting him, right? Because whatever it is, it's pressing on him until he thinks he's going to die. And he just wants rest from this, and wants rest from the idea that he's being possessed, and from the idea of his people ridiculing him. But this tells us something about Muhammad. When at the first sign of trouble, you want to go hurl yourself off a cliff in order to avoid embarrassment.
To show a contrast with the true prophets of God, it's vitally important to let the audience know that any time a true prophet or a righteous person has an encounter with God or an angel or even the Holy Spirit of God, their initial response is fear, but it's that entity, whether God himself or the angel or the Holy Spirit, that comforts the person and says, do not be afraid, taking away their fears in order to have this encounter with God. So you see the difference there, David? Here, instead of the Spirit comforting Muhammad, the Spirit traumatizes Muhammad to the extent that Muhammad wants to commit suicide. It takes individuals who are not there, who are not privy to this encounter, to encourage him. He's not demon-possessed, whereas the true prophets of God or the servants of God they're encouraged by the entity in question. Like when Gabriel appears to Mary, Gabriel tells Mary, do not be afraid. Or when he appears to Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, he tells him, do not be afraid. So you see the difference between what this spirit did to Muhammad and God's true spirit messengers do when they're sent to reveal God's revelations to God's true servants.
It's almost as if these are totally different Gabriels we're dealing with here.
Definitely.
Right? All right, let me read one more passage about Muhammad's suicide attempts, because after he starts receiving the revelations, he eventually stops receiving the revelations. And watch his reaction. This is Sahih al-Bukhari, number 6982. It says, but after a few days, Waraka died, and the divine revelation was also paused for a while, and the prophet became so sad, as we have heard, that he intended several times to throw himself from the tops of high mountains. And every time he went up to the top of a mountain in order to throw himself down, Jibreel would appear before him and say, O Muhammad, you are indeed Allah's messenger in truth, whereupon his heart would become quiet, and he would calm down and would return home. Now, think about this, Sam. Every time something happens that he doesn't like, he goes up to throw himself off a cliff. Right. This is the guy that Muslims are trusting with their salvation, to guide them to the path of salvation. A guy who says, oh, something's going bad today. Let me go hurl myself off a cliff. This is some wild stuff.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. In the following clip, you're going to see the dishonesty of the Dawaganda guys. You're going to see an example where Farid and his cousin straight up say that the companions of Muhammad didn't notice anything wrong with him. They never noticed he was having any symptoms of epilepsy. They then go on to say that none of his enemies mentioned that there was anything wrong with Muhammad's behavior. What they should have said was, yes, they thought he was crazy. And they were wrong. But instead they straight up lie and said there's no such evidence anywhere. Let's take a look and see what the Quran itself records as the enemies of Muhammad saying. But first, I give you Farid.
Now, do we have any narration that the Prophet has been witnessed to have a seizure clearly by any of his companions or his enemies? We do not. I mean, they knew what seizures were. They might have not known what a focal seizure was, but they definitely know what is the difference between being normal and being in an abnormal state where you do not reply, or where you lose speech, or where you start doing weird abnormal movements. So
okay.
the Prophet's enemies did not witness him having any abnormal states that are indicative of a seizure.
I'd like to point out something in regards to the points that you've mentioned about the lack of documentation of a seizure to the audience. Non-Muslim audience members, and perhaps even some Muslims, would maybe assume that, hey, the Muslims themselves chose not to document this. Seizures occurred, but they didn't document this. I say that this is impossible, because the early Muslims, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, the early historians documented everything. Remember, these are the same people that brought to you the satanic verses. These are the same people that brought to you information about Rasulullah marrying Zainab. These are the same people that brought you information about Rasulullah marrying Aisha. These are the same people that brought you every single argument that Islamophobes use and critics of Islam use against the Prophet, peace be upon him. So it's extremely, extremely unlikely that 100,000 companions would simply ignore seizures occurring. That's just from a historical point of view.
Keep the companions aside. What about the enemies? I mean, if he was an epileptic person, they would have used that as a very good propaganda against him.
Yes, you are correct. The Quran itself often quotes and preserves the arguments that are brought forth by non-Muslims. So they accused him of being a poet, or a sorcerer, or someone who is insane. However, they never accused him of having seizures. So
Exactly.
that's another point.
Oh
All
my God.
right. So
I'm laughing. They're so wrong. It's funny.
exactly. So they're saying that Muhammad's contemporaries like never saw anything weird with him. Like they never. But we just saw a reference that they were like sending doctors, faith healers to check up on the guy. And we will see now that in fact it wasn't just a few verses. They used the word majnoon, demon possessed, the one that could be synonymously, as per Islamic scholars, used for epilepsy, about more than 10 times in the Quran, right? So these guys create this illusion where they lie basically to say that, oh, the contemporaries of Muhammad weren't saying anything weird about him. He straight up says they didn't say that they saw anything abnormal about them. But we'll see that they'll explicitly say that we saw the abnormalities due to the revelations, and hence we call them crazy. So they create this facade where they're now going to say there were no seizures or there were no secondary generalizations. They're acting as if there are none, but we have literally sections, and we will show you how wrong and how much you lie. You're a pathological liar. Let's go to the next slide.
It really does feel like when he's listening, he knows that this is wrong, but he's just not saying it.
Now,
All right, so now we're at this slide. So these are all the Quranic verses that mention the word majnoon. I don't know if you can see them clear enough, but I'll read them out to you. 34:8, perfect. Has he invented about Allah or lie, or is there in him madness? Right? Bihi jinn. There's like a jinn in him. Is there a madness inflicted by him? That's what the verse. And we're going to go left to right, up and down. 44:14, they turn their backs on him, saying, he is tutored, he is possessed. The word here, majnoon, again, the same word for jinn possession as we talked about. 23:70, we see, why do they say he is possessed? Am yaquluna bihi jinn. Again, he has a jinn in him or something. Has he brought them the truth and most of them hate it? And 68:2. Now, Surah 68 is actually the second surah that was revealed according to many hadith. Now, in the second surah alone, the second verse says, your Lord's grace does not make you prophet a madman. So from the get-go, people were noticing this about him. And again, the word used here is ma anta bi ni'mati rabbika bi majnoon, that you are majnoon, crazy, jinn afflicted. Some say muddled dreams, others say he made it up, yet others say he's just a poet. Let him show us a sign. So a lot of times they would use the kahin, crazy poet, as a synonym for mad people. In 15:6, we say, receiver of this Quran, you are definitely mad. Like they were straight up calling him, you are crazy. Al-Zikru innaka la majnoon, that you are jinn afflicted, you're crazy. They are not the words of a poet, how little you believe in its continuation. This next verse says, nor the words of a soothsayer, how little you reflect. In 37:36, we see again, are we to forsake our gods for a mad poet? Lisha'irim majnoon. Again, the same word. 68:51, the disbelievers almost strike you down with their looks when they hear the Quran. They say, he must be mad. لَيَقُولُونَ إِنَّهُ لَمَجْنُونَ. Again, say the Prophet, I advise you to do one thing only, stand before God in pairs or single and think there is no sign of madness in your companion. He is only for warning you before severe suffering arrives. Ma bisahibikum min jinn. So he's again talking about him afflicted with insanity and jinns. And then lastly, in 52:29, on the top right, we see, so the Prophet remind people by the grace of your Lord that you are neither an oracle nor a madman. Bikahini wala majnoon. Again, Muhammad is being labeled as crazy. As explicit as the Meccans could have gotten in their descriptions, calling him crazy, the same word majnoon that Muslim scholars say can be used to refer to epilepsy. The black woman might have used that words as well. We come circling back to this. Now you tell me, was Farid or his cousin saying that they didn't notice anything wrong with him? Was he lying?
No, it's also interesting that imagine God keeps telling you, you're not crazy, you're not crazy,
The
you're not,
voice in the head tells you you're not crazy.
you're not crazy. Like that's the craziest thing ever.
Oh my God, right? So, why are there so many verses dedicated to Muhammad's sanity? Why did the people call Muhammad crazy from the get-go? Did they see his condition as bizarre? Why was he called a soothsayer or a poet? Next slide, you will see another interesting bit. Remember, Farid's cousin said that they never noticed anything abnormal about him? In one of those verses, if you look up Tafsir of Razi 7:184 and of Tafsir of 15:6, he straight up says the Prophet would be enveloped in a strange condition whilst receiving revelation. His face would change, become pale, and his condition would resemble swooning or fainting. And he's talking about why they would call him crazy. And he says, this is why, because they saw his condition. The people started seeing Muhammad having these seizure-like episodes. Due to lack of medical understanding, they could only assume jinn possession or madness as a possible cause. The conditions Muhammad experienced were definitely noticed as very bizarre by his contemporaries. Now that we've established that people did in fact see him in abnormal states and did call him crazy, and to a huge extent where it ended up being in the Quran so many times, you have to assume that this must have been something abnormal for the people to have noticed.